You're listening to the Just Japan podcast. Everything you want to know about Japan.
Well, hey there, folks, and welcome to episode number 224 of the Just Japan podcast. Everything you want to know about Japan. My name's Kevin O'Shea. I'm the Canadian host of this long-standing, long-running podcast all about Japan, where each week I bring to you a different, well, maybe not each week, each episode I bring to you a different guest, chatting about a different aspect of life in Japan. And this week, I'm chatting with Kansai Pee Jay, that American who is based in Osaka, Japan. He's been on the podcast so many times, I can't even count. And one thing about PJ, there's a lot of interesting things about him. He's often on talking about working at universities, getting university jobs. But he is a castle enthusiast. One of his hobbies is to study about castles, to learn about castles, and to travel around Japan visiting castles. And he is on this episode to talk all about his hobby of learning about castles in Japan, studying them. He's got a fantastic story. The opening of the podcast, his story about falling in love with Himeji Castle as a child and then coming to work in Himeji is a really cool story. You guys are going to dig it. The rest of the interview was very fascinating. I learned a lot. It was a great conversation. So let's jump into this conversation, episode 224 of the podcast, all about Japanese castles. And we're back with another episode of the Just Japan podcast. It's me, Kevin, your host, and I'm back with someone who, back in the day, in the OG days of the Just Japan podcast, pre-long hiatus, pre-dark long winter, when I was making episodes for a few years, this guy was on the podcast more times than you could shake a stick at. PJ, welcome back to the podcast.
Hello and salutations. Good to be back.
So for those of you who may be new to the Just Japan podcast, and I know there are quite a few of you who are, especially those who joined us when we started when I brought back episodes last fall, some of you may not know PJ. Some of you definitely do. And I know that there's a lot of you on the Facebook group who in the past have asked for more PJ, which is fantastic.
Or less. But you can't please everybody.
No, I've just been hearing positive things so far. We'll see what happens after this episode. PJ, could you tell the listeners just a little bit about yourself, where you are and your connection to Japan?
My name is PJ, or Patrick, but everybody calls me PJ. I've been in Japan, 25 plus years. Mm-hmm. I came over here in between undergrad and graduate work and fell in love / hate, but fell in nonetheless, and became a long timer. I've lived here 3 times. First time was 2 years and then a year. And then I've been back now for 20 plus years, 24, 25 years. I don't know. I met you. Mm-hmm. I don't even remember when, but back in the early days of
it would have been 2008 we met.
Oh, wow.
That's the year that I arrived.
More hair then.
Yeah.
Oh, so did I, frankly. But I shaved it that point.
I don't know about you, but I did. And the little
that's not kind.
And the little more I had was actually darker in color as well. I came to Japan in 2008, and I had connected with you on YouTube beforehand. I was a YouTube content creator, as were you, and then we met up at some point in 2008, maybe a few months after I'd arrived, met you and a few other YouTubers, and we kind of formed our little Kansai community where we'd hang out in person, and as the kids call it today, IRL, We'd hang out IRL.
I think that's the kids before the current. It's not even the kids anymore.
Yeah, it's kids.
I don't think the young ones say IRL anymore.
It was the kids before.
I don't know what they do say, but they don't say that.
Yeah, so we met up then, and then since then, I started the Just Japan podcast in about 14 possibly I started, and you were on many episodes talking about many topics. There were many episodes you were on where we had no topics. We just shot the breeze about Japan. Sometimes it would be like the two of us. We'd have Mully on, Jim Mullins, and
Mully.
Yeah, maybe some other people, and we'd just like literally just kind of ramble on about Japan, about what was going on, and just chin wagging.
Good days.
Those were great times. But this week we actually do have a topic. As one thing that as we hear in the news all about the over tourism in Japan.
Yes.
This year there are, I think I've heard something, a statistic, almost double the number of inbound visitors as opposed to last year.
Is it that much? Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. And one of the things that you hear about often in the news is that they are talking about, different organizations, different places, restaurants having different prices for inbound tourists. And one place near and dear to your heart is one of them, Himeji Castle, where they're talking about a $5 fee for locals and about a $30 fee for foreigners. So we are this week going to be talking about on the podcast about castles in Japan, because PJ, you are a castle enthusiast.
I believe I am.
He is. So PJ is going to chat with us guys today about castles in Japan. He won't claim you're not an expert,
No.
but you are, again, an enthusiast, and you're someone who enjoys traveling around and seeing castles. So let's talk castles, PJ.
Okay.
Let's talk castles. So let's start off with just asking about. I'll ask you, what is your kind of fascination, or what draws you to castles in Japan?
What a fine question, sir.
Thank you so much.
Indeed. Here we go. I'll try to make this as succinct as possible, but you know me. In any case, I was a young boy, and my family traveled to Disney World. I don't know how old I was, elementary maybe, and I, even as a kid, I was a curmudgeon that you know and that you know and love now.
And tolerate. Yes.
In any case, I didn't enjoy Disney too much. All that manifested happiness is just annoying to me. But I really enjoyed Epcot Center.
Okay.
The future thing, and then one of their big things at the time was you could go around that little lake they had, and you'd go to the different countries and cultures, and they had a Japan area, and I was drawn to that because I grew up in Hawaii, so it's very Japan-centric culture and whatnot. And I have had an obsession with plastic modeling, a failed obsession. First it was planes, and then submarines, and then later castles, and I made 3, maybe 4 models my entire life, and I kept none of them.
Okay.
But at this time, while I was at Epcot Center, I bought a model of a Japanese castle in the Japan area of Epcot Center called Shirasagi-jo, which is, there you go. He's showing actually that's Osaka, isn't it?
No, that one's Osaka. I've got some little toy castle models called nano blocks, which are kind of like miniature Lego. And I've got Osaka Castle, and I've got Himeji Castle, which I have not made yet. But yeah, continue with your story.
Anyway, so I really like this model, and I fancied myself I was going to be a plastic modeler. It never worked out. But the point is, I bought this model and took it home, and I built it. It's one of the few models that I did build. And it was just of the main keep and the surround, they call them Baileys or Maru. Yeah. But it was just the main area of the castle of Himeji, but it was just titled Shirasagi-jo, which means white heron or white egret castle.
I think white egret.
Yeah. And in any case, so I didn't connect it to Himeji, and that'll be later in the story important. Anyway, I built this, and I love this model, and it sat in my room in Hawaii when I grew up in junior and senior high school, and I just used to look at this castle all the time. In any case, at some point, boys put away their toys, and I went off to college and never looked back. I don't know what, I'm assuming my parents threw away the model. Whatever. The point is, I went to university and I lived my life, and I was a Japanese history major eventually, and
Okay.
I was applying to the top 4 graduate schools in the U.S. For PhD, and my
Okay.
advisor said, here's the thing: you have a 4.0 in history, a 3.8 overall, but it doesn't matter. You're coming from a state school, and there's just too many people applying for these spots. An issue in academia in general, but and he said, yeah, here's a problem: you're not going to get in. I'm good for you, and I'll write you the rec, but you need to do something to make your resume, your CV, a little bit better. So I recommend going to Japan.
Okay.
And so I had looked into the JET program and a couple other options while I was applying for graduate school, and he correctly predicted that of the 4 schools I got into, only one of them, and I was waitlisted for that school. And it was a shock to a guy that I got a 4.0, and I thought I was going to be somebody. That didn't work out. But the point is, nonetheless, he said, well, here's this option. I looked into the JET program, and I had missed the deadline by just a few days, but I had missed it. And I was very lucky that Phoenix, Arizona was a sister city of Himeji, Japan, which is in Hyogo, which is where you lived, and our friend Sarah, and quite a few others. Anyway, I didn't know any of that at that time, and it just said the problem is they were looking for, it was a teacher exchange program. I wasn't a certified teacher, but at the time, Arizona did not give, what is it, what do you call it? When you do something for a long time and you get a rank, because seniority, they would lose their seniority. Phoenix teachers would lose their seniority if they went abroad for 1 to 3 years.
Oh, if they took a sabbatical, they would lose seniority.
Yeah, they lose their seniority at that time. It changed later. Because of that, only the young teachers or people that really needed to get out for a while.
Yeah.
Anyway, they were looking for 14 teachers a year, or 14 teachers for the program, and however many they could get each year would be good. They were massively short this year, and as luck would have it, someone said, well, if we can't find a teacher, let's call all the state schools or private schools as well. Anybody studying Japanese, anything, history, culture, language, whatever. We'll put out to the notice to those departments. And one came out just after I found out I couldn't do the JET program because I'd missed the deadline. So I applied, and boom, I was accepted. And anyway, I ended up going to Himeji. And this is, now for your audience, this will be a bit shocking, but this is pre-internet. We didn't have, you couldn't look this stuff up. I went to the Tucson library and looked up Himeji, and it had one
in books, huh?
Yeah, in an Encyclopedia Britannica, I believe. And it had like 2 lines for the city. That was it. Anyway, I didn't know much, and but I wanted to go, and it was fine. So I went, and the very first day that we're there, we fly into the airport. They pick us up. By the time we get to Himeji, because it's a couple hours away from the airport, Osaka Airport at the time, we're driving by the castle, and it's beautiful. It's lit up at night. They kept these big halogen lights until the Shinkansen, last bullet train that would pass the city. They turn it off at that point. But before then, it was lit up all night, and it was, it was beautiful to live in that city. You never get lost, because as long as you could see the castle, you knew where you were. And anyway, we're driving by it, and it's beautiful. And I'm looking at this thing, and I'm thinking, oh, I've seen that somewhere. I didn't know where I'd seen it, but I knew I had seen it. And they kept calling it Himeji Castle, Himeji Joe. Himeji, not Himeji. Himeji Joe. And anyway, I'm going, I know that thing. And so they let us off in our new apartments, and the very next day they picked us up, and we had to fill out a bunch of paperwork at the city hall and to get us certified and what have you. And then in the afternoon they said, well, we're going to take you on a castle tour. And I was a Japanese history major, so I was definitely looking forward to it. But as we went on the tour, we kept walking, and turning left and turning right, and I would start to say, we're like a group of 10 or 12 of us at that time, and we're walking, I'm going, and we're going to turn left here, And then we turn left, and then I'm going, and we're gonna go right here, and we're gonna go up, and how do people keep asking, how do you know that? I'm going, I don't know. I just had this very almost like, that deja vu experience that I had known it. Now later on, I realized I known it because I built it, and I stared at it for hours and hours and hours on end under a different name, Shirasagi Joe, and so I didn't know. And anyway, so the tour guide that spoke English, they had a volunteer English tour guide association and Japanese person, and they thought this was very funny that they would ask me, what do you think we're going to see next? And everyone would turn to me, and I'm going, I don't know, but maybe this or that. And anyway, by the time we were done with the tour, he was saying, oh, you really should be a tour guide. We have an English association. There's a test in Japanese, but if we could work it out, would you want to do this? And the mayor's representative just got all giddy because he saw, oh, this will be in the news. And sure enough, it was. And the mayor at that time, it was right at the end of the bubble, was still looking for those international stories. And so they it was made clear to me that if I did this, there would be benefits.
For you to become a foreign English-speaking tour guide.
Yeah, the first in the country, so it seemed. And by the way, there were foreign academics who knew a billion times more about castles, but none of them were tour guides. And I had been a tour guide at a submarine museum in Honolulu, and then earlier. So I'd done this stuff, and I liked it. I said, yeah, sure, I'll do this. So anyway, but I didn't realize it was my castle that I had built until the first day of training, and they hand me this book that they were part of it was
you to memorize.
Well, it was a book written in the 60s by, I can't even remember the author anymore, but they had copied it literally on an old Xerox machine with the pages doubled over, and anyway, and it referred to it as Shirasagi Jo. And I go, I know that castle, and I built it, and anyway, so the mystery was ended. But it's funny because when I went on a few months later to take the Castle Association Tour Guides test, since they had never had a foreigner, they never had a test in English. And this was before Google and DeepL. You couldn't do any of that. So they had to have 3 people in the room, one to translate the question, one to hear my answer, and one to verify that the other 2 were speaking truth. And then someone came down from Tokyo to interview me. It was an oral test. It was a hoot. Anyway, I passed.
I might have a visual right now of the movie Back to School with Rodney Dangerfield. Do you ever see that? When he's like sitting in the chair, and they've got like
there were elements.
What's the end of this question? Say it.
Anyway, Himeji got very thrilled, and I was on the radio, and I did a TV interview and the newspaper interview, and then after that,
all the things they love
went away, because at that time we had maybe 4 or 5 foreigners visiting Himeji a week. That's it. Okay. And there were 12 fluent Japanese speakers of English.
Okay.
And so they didn't really need me. So really, I would go in every other weekend and sit there and read history books. Anything that was in English or simple Japanese anyway.
Yeah.
But I loved it, and I did it for those 3 years two years that I was there, and then a year when I came back from Takasago. Anyway, and that was the beginning of my love of castles. And as you know, I did study Japanese history. My undergrad, my graduate work was all in linguistics or applied linguistics, but my undergrad was in Japanese history. And Himeji is the largest extant castle in Japan. And it was the first of Japan's UNESCO World Heritage sites that year that I joined. So there was nothing in Tokyo, nothing in Kyoto, nothing in the entire country that has a billion historical monuments worth recording, but Himeji somehow got in first. And they were so darn proud of that. I mean, it was a small city of less than 1 million, or about 1 million people, which in Japan is a small city. But they were so proud. They really thought this UNESCO World Heritage label would change the city. It didn't, but certainly it brought a lot of people in eventually. And anyway, so I was part of that, and the excitement of that, and it was palpable. They talked about it in, we were English teachers, ALTs or whatever. This was a regular part of the lesson to bring up the castle and bring up UNESCO and World Heritage sites and the whole thing. And to be a part of it was really, really cool. So that when I came back to Japan my third time, several years later, I just started going to castles. And castles, I'll broadly define. Sometimes it's just a marker in the ground. It says there was a castle here. I mean, Japan had 30,000 fortifications and maybe about 5,000. So I've heard. I don't have the sources in front of me, but it's oft cited that there were more than 5,000 castles. About 70% were made during the Warring States period in Japan. And that was a time when basically everything fell apart. And there was an emperor and there was a shogun, but they had no control, and everything was done locally through force, brute force. And it was about a 150-year period. Okay, that's debatable, but 100-year anyway. And about 70% of these 5,000 castles were built. They mostly started out as mountain castles. Basically, there are 4 types of castles in Japan, very, very broadly. Mountain castles, hill castles, which Himeji is, and so is Osaka, technically, although to see the hill is really hard. But the point is, mountain castles, hill castles, flatland castles, like Nijo Castle in Kyoto. And then a very small category that only 3 or 4 castles ever fit into, sea castles. Castles that were built against the ocean. They use the sea as part of the...
Like the idea of a maritime fortress, that kind of thing, a maritime fort. Yeah.
Exactly. So Himeji is a hill castle.
Yeah.
And so was Akashi, which is one of the castles that Kevin and I have explored with Munzi and geocaching before that. So anyway, that's enough.
Yeah, that's really cool. No, I mean that's a fantastic story. I'm sitting here,
and 90% of it's true.
Yeah, I'm sitting here with my little nano blocks, Himeji Castle, which I do need to build. These are great nano blocks. Next time I'm in Japan,
are they available here? I've never seen them. Only through you.
Yeah. They have. If you go, they're amazing. If you go to especially the electronic shops, their toy sections, like Yamada Denki, Joshin. If you go to Big Camera, they all have big sections. And this will cost, that's about san yen. So that's
about $20 for those of you listening.
$20. And they're neat little things, like miniature Lego. Yeah, they're called nano blocks. So, I mean, they're a lot of fun. That's an afternoon of building, an hour and a half, 2 hours of building to make that.
That looks nice. That looks like something I could get into.
These are cool.
Modeling never worked out, but that could work.
I've got them on my desk, and there's I've got Osaka Castle, I've got Himeji Castle. I want to get Nogaya Castle. So I mean, for me, I think my first my foray into castles, I didn't have the background and interest in Japan growing up. Actually, Japan was never on my radar. I accidentally became a Japan person. I have since then become a Japanophile, I suppose, after the fact. But I mean, I was someone who had never had an interest in Japan at all. I ended up teaching English in Korea, and I happened to meet my Japanese wife in Korea. I was teaching English, she was teaching Japanese. And then I came to Japan on a holiday and actually proposed to my wife next to Himeji Castle at the gardens they have called Kokoen, I think it's called.
I remember, yes. So you told me this story.
Yeah, and when we visited last summer, we visited Japan. No, 2020 when we were there, we went there, and we found the same. I found the very spot where I proposed to her and showed the kids. And an interesting thing is that last year we were there. We went to Himeji-jo again. I mean, I always want to go there. But now, you mentioned when you were originally there would be 5 to 10, foreign tourists a year. Well, now the term over tourism is thrown around a lot. There were definitely a lot No, there weren't even a lot then. We went there. There were definitely some like foreigners around, but
Not
I would
that. Man.
I wouldn't say tons of
Well,
them. And there were probably more Japanese tourists and foreign tourists.
it
But
is the largest extant castle in Japan, so you'll
Mm.
get a lot of domestic tourism as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's but like what's jumping out of my mind, I haven't been to that many castles, like I've been to Matsue.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's a
Matsue City.
beautiful castle.
That's a gorgeous castle. I've been to, of course, Himeji-jo many times, Osaka-jo, Akashi Castle, which doesn't have the main keep. It just
No,
has
not anymore. Yeah.
and then last year we went to Nijo, and that was very interesting. That had not been on my radar. We didn't plan on it. We actually went on a day trip just because my son wanted to see places I did not want to go. He wanted to see Kinkakuji, the Golden Pavilion. I was just like, oh God, really? Like that's a place where there is over tourism. But we went there because it was on his bucket list. So let's
Wanted
go.
to see it, sure.
Let's go
And
see
it is
it.
beautiful. If you didn't have 5,000 tourists
Yeah.
standing around you, and during COVID, one of the very few benefits of COVID, as you found out yourself, was that you could go to some of these temples, shrines, and castles that were overcrowded and be there alone.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
it was lovely. Yeah.
Yeah, it was really great. But we went to last summer. We just on a spur of the moment said let's go to Nijo, and what a neat place! So different.
Yes.
And it is a flat place in a flat place, but the castle itself isn't tall. It's so ornate, so spread out, so neat, and there were very few tourists there too. There weren't many people there, and we had just left the Golden Pavilion, Kinkakuji, which was jam packed with tourists, and a few other spots that were jam packed. And we went to Nijo Castle, and there were very few people
Very
there.
few people there.
Yeah.
Which unfortunately is no longer true, but the Nijo Castle is a castle in name only. It's the Flatland Castle. This was originally a palace.
Yeah, I guess, and that's what it looks more like, a palace.
Yeah. And what you were touring was, if you visit the castles, you're mostly looking at the rock walls, the occasional turret. Some have the main keep, the tenshu in Japanese. Whereas Nijo has kept its palace, Goten, that the shogun, or before him, the military governor, would reside in. And it's beautiful and it's ornate.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is a flatland castle built in the middle of the city, more as, just like a consulate would be. Countries have consulates and embassies. This was the shogun's consulate in Kyoto whenever he or his appointed official would drop by Kyoto to make sure everyone's behaving. They would hang out there. And the actual, it goes back before it was a castle. It was a yakata. I might be saying that wrong, but that's what's jumping to my mind now. A fortified palace. But eventually it was built as a proper castle. And it's beautiful. If anyone gets a chance to visit Kyoto, I definitely recommend Nijo, just because, as you point out, it's less visited than some of the temples. It shows you a broader variety of architecture. It's still all upper class architecture for sure.
Yeah.
But you'll see a lot more than you would at a temple or a shrine. And, there are very few flatland castles because, city property is valuable. And there are very few cities that kept their castles. There were over 5,000 of them, and most of them were taken away either from World War II, they were bombed, or they were burned out from, lightning, or when the Tokugawa came to power, they made this rule saying that the daimyo the lords could only have one main castle per territory. Now, there were exceptions. But generally speaking, a lot of castles were disassembled at that point. And right now, we've only got about 200 castles in existence. And by that, I mean, including just stoneworks or just a little bit would count in that number. Of fully extant, well, there's no full castle at all. But of castles that have proper grounds with, stoneworks and buildings and turrets and what have you, there's less than 150, and 100 are on the official list. The Japanese Castle Association with the Japanese tourist organization, got together and they made a list of 100 best castles. And it's a lot of Japanese and quite a few foreign residents have made it their goal to see all 100. I don't know if I'll be that ambitious. I've seen about 30 and there's about another 20 that I want to see.
Okay.
But yeah, there's 100 on this list, and anyway, so there's about 200 that still exist to some degree or another, and Nijo is one of the few that has the palace portion.
It's interesting. I made a my very sometimes again podcast, the Supernatural Japan podcast. I did an episode on the ghosts of Hachioji Castle, which is a castle ruins outside of Tokyo, and that's supposed to be quite a haunted place with a lot of blood had been spilled. But that's a ruins as well. There's not an actual castle there. So what I'm curious about, what are, you said you've been about 30. Obviously, we know you have a deep affinity for Himeji Castle, but what else? So what are your favorites? Which are the ones at the top of your list that you love the most?
Oh, that's a toughie. If I had to put them on there,
and I'm then going to ask you after that to let me know which ones do you think are the most overrated.
Okay. Well, that's a bit tough, but I would say one of my favorites is not even a castle anymore. It's just the stoneworks. It's in Hyogo, where you used to live in the mountains in the center, called Takeda-jo.
Oh, okay. I've heard of it and I've seen pictures and stuff.
Worth visiting. All that's left is the stoneworks, and they've had to do a lot of update on that because stone falls. But it's up on the top of a mountain in the middle of a mountain range.
Yeah, it gets all that amazing mist around it, right?
Yes. And it is amazing. It's one of the few places where in the Instagram world, you look at a picture, you go, wow, and then you go there going, eh. Well, this is the opposite, where the reality is so much more beautiful than the pictures would show. And again, it's just nothing but stoneworks. But to go there, you really saw, I think, castles in the early part of the Warring State period. They started out as mountain fortifications, Yamajiro, and they are. It's just, you could see two different valleys. You could see for dozens, if not hundreds of miles. Very impressive, and so that'll always be. I've only been there 2 or 3 times, but it's hard to get to because it's not in a big city, and it's not even close to a train. You could take a train there, and then you're going to take a 30-minute bus, or it's a pain to get to, but it is beautiful. So that's on my top list. Next would be, and this will be on both lists that you're about to mention for different reasons, Osaka-jo, where I live in the city of Osaka, was definitely one of my most overrated castles, but has become over time to be one of my favorites. Yes, it is a cement rebuild from the 50s that's got air conditioning, but it's got lovely models inside. It shows the grandeur, I think. Thank you. Yeah, I'm sorry. Anyway, it's great for seeing the layout of a castle, the strategic layout of the different baileys or maru. The stonework is great. And, one of the things with castles is that if you're disabled in any way or physically challenged or just elderly, most of these castles are not for you because you're going up steep stairs and unair-conditioned environments. But, these cement rebuilds, which a lot of people poo-poo, and I did too at first. I see the beauty. Taking my mother, who was in her 80s at the time, to this castle. She could go to the top and look out. It was air conditioned. It had an elevator. And then they filled the keep with models and relics and things like that that people could look at and kind of get the context without visiting a separate, distinct museum. Osaka, plus that, as you know, anyone who's ever spent time in the Kansai, we hang out in Osaka Castle Park on the regular. Yeah. It's a huge park. You can barbecue in certain areas. You can drink in most of it. There's places to shop. There's places to hike. There's walking trails. We use it in Munzi, the game that we both play, geocaching. It's just a great park. People do. They look at the cherry blossoms there, the fall foliage a little bit less so, but still, it's one of those parks that the whole area of the Kansai, they flock to this castle several times a year.
Yeah,
And
every time we go to Osaka to visit my wife's family, like we're definitely always making a stop or more than one at Osaka Castle Park. It's just a go-to place for so many people. It's just So that's a cool one. I've been there too.
I would also. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah. Go ahead. What else?
Just a couple more on the list. I'll say Inuyama-jo, which is in Aichi, north of Nagoya. I didn't visit it this most recent time, but 20 years ago I went there, and it is the oldest keep. Well, that's debated. A couple of places claim this, but historians would say this was the oldest keep. It's hundreds of years old. And we should stop for a second and explain that. People go, hundreds of years old? It's not very old at all. Japanese castles are built mostly of organic materials, plaster, wood, clay tiles, stone and earthenworks for sure. But because of the nature of the design, they have to be rebuilt on the regular.
Yeah. Like shrines. Like shrines and temples.
Shrines and temples, yes.
Like when you have we got married at where we got married in down in Tennoji, the big shrine there. My brain is.
Well, there's several.
Yeah, I'm having a brain fart right now. Which is the name of it?
Mai would be upset with you on this one.
Yeah. Oh gosh. I'll Google this. But the shrine where we got married, it's been there for, they say, like 25, no, like over 1,000 years.
Yes.
Sumiyoshi Taisha.
Yes.
Shrine.
Oh, that's a beautiful one.
And I mean, I'm like, how could this be here for over 1,000 years? Well, because the structures have been rebuilt many times over that 1,000 years.
25 to 50, sometimes 75 years.
It's just on the original location, and there had been the shrine.
And the original, and the important part, to call something an extant design in Japanese history of architecture, it's got to be built the same way. So for example, castles and temples didn't use nails. They used other fastening structures, which are a bit flexible, which is important for earthquake-prone areas. But even Himeji was just redone about 10 years ago, and people go, "Well, how does it count as an extant castle?" Well, because that structure has just been rebuilt and rebuilt and rebuilt and rebuilt. Although, again, that's another thing when people always ask how old is a particular castle. Well, you could say there's a fortification. Like Himeji had a fortification there since the 1300s. But the castle that we know came from the 1600s.
Okay.
So, they evolve as the political and cultural settings evolve. But anyway, so I put Inuyama-jo as one of the oldest keeps. It's on a mountain north of Nagoya. I put Nagoya up there, even though you can no longer go in the main building. The main keep is from 2018. They put it off limits because it doesn't meet earthquake standards. But what they did, and they're going to rebuild it eventually, authentically. But what they did in the early 2000s, they started raising money to rebuild the palaces that existed within the castle grounds, which Himeji is missing, although you saw when you went to the garden, that's rebuilt. But like Nijo-jo is one of the oldest palaces that is existing. And these the reason why is you've got your stoneworks, you've got your moats, you've got your main strategic fortifications, but the buildings in between all of that would change on the regular. Every decade, every 5 years, every 20 years, you'd rebuild it. Like Nagoya-jo, well, the first palace was put in the Honmaru, which is the main bailey, right next to the keep, so the Lord, if in danger, could go up to the keep and be protected, right? The keep itself is not comfortable. You're going up steep stairs. It's damp. It's cold in winter. It's hot in summer. It's not comfortable. They would build a palace next door, and they would live in that. And, as the Tokugawa peace kind of took hold, people would say, well, yeah, the main Bailey, the Honmaru, is kind of tight by necessity, right? The Baileys get bigger as you get farther out from the main keep.
Yeah.
So a lot of them would move to the Ninomaru or even the Sannomaru, the second or the third Bailey, because they got more space and they built a bigger palace. But they've rebuilt it in Nagoya in the Honmaru, the main Bailey, and I just toured it 2 weeks ago, and it is built. The 3/4 of it were rebuilt exactly as it was, because the Japanese, like the Chinese, are tremendous note takers and history record keepers. So they knew everything from how it was built to the size of each room.
Yeah.
A lot of the ornaments that existed within each room had been kept anyway. So when the building had been collapsed and reused for a different purpose, well, they kept that stuff in storage or in a museum anyway. So they had a lot. So it's really worth seeing. But the reason why I like Nagoya, because this is right after Tokugawa Ieyasu became shogun in 1603. He wanted to build a big castle, and so he took all the enemies, the daimyo, the lords, and he said, all of you are going to contribute to the defense of the nation, and you're all going to help build this and a dozen other castles that I own, but you're going to build it for the good of the nation and the good of the emperor. And he did this on purpose. He wanted them to offload all their excess cash building his castle. And they had to do it in person. So they all had to come and see how grandiose this castle was. And like Osaka, like Edojo, which is Tokyo, like Nagoya, these are huge, massive castles built after the Warring States period. They're less strategic and more political. Okay. They're the moment when you go, wow, we can't fight that. And the point is, so he went to all the lords, all the daimyo, and said, you're all going to contribute a percentage of your wealth. And you can even mark the stones that you bring. You can even get credit for every artisan or carpenter that you bring. You'll get credit for all of it, but you're going to build this castle for me. And Nagoya is huge, like Osaka. They're overly huge. They're not the kind of castles you saw during the Warring States period where people were literally fighting valley to valley. I saw another castle, which is now on my favorite list, Okazaki, which is the birthplace of Tokugawa Ieyasu, who, by the way, for our listeners, is the basis of Toranaga in the Shogun series. It's Tokugawa Ieyasu historically. This was where he was born, and it is a rustic castle. It's all of these great design ideas in compact form. It's built on a hill in the middle of a village, very tight, very tiny space, but very well done. The idea that, the Maruwashi, they had this kind of circular design although there are different strategies for that, but the design I like the most are this circular kind of corkscrew design. The reason is that the average soldier in an army during the Middle Warring States period had these spears, which could be anywhere from 6 foot to 25 foot in length. And these 25-foot long ones were the predominant ones because you want to be able to poke people on horses and get people over moats. The problem is turning in formation on a 90-degree angle doesn't really work with these things. Frankly, it's hard to do so in armor and with the swords anyway. Mm-hmm. With spears, it's practically impossible without poking one of your marching mates. And that was the point of having a circular corkscrew design, was that you kept asking them to do 90-degree turns, usually one direction, but sometimes you'd reverse it up and make them switch. And the whole idea is that with these, 20-foot, 30-foot spears, you're going to have a real hard time turning 90 degrees under a gate and going to the next gate and then turning back and forth without poking your own people. And that was the idea of it all, or part of the idea of it all. But anyway, so the reason, to get back to what we were saying a bit earlier, was because these are made of wood and plaster, they age and degrade very quickly, and they've got to be rebuilt every 20, 30, 50, 70 years, depending on the nature of it. And so unlike maybe European castles or certain castles in other parts of the world, you can't say that this is 500 years old or 1,000 years old, but you can say the design is, or the earthworks that it's based on.
Yeah.
Those lasted, 500, 1,000, beyond 2,000 years, and they're still extant. And Himeji, the stoneworks and the moats that still exist have been there for between 800 and 1,500 years. So that, it's been a bit.
Yeah.
But the problem is most of the castles lost their full grandeur. I still have trouble with that word. We've lost it because most castles only exist to the first moats or the second moats.
Yeah.
Whereas, as in common with European design, you're talking about a staged defense, so that you might have 3 or even 4 layers out of moats. And by the way, dry moats, people poo-poo dry moats, but dry moats are just as good as of wet moats, because people still have to jump down in them, run across, and climb up the other side, and it doesn't really work out. So there are in Japanese castles, there's a combination of dry moats and wet moats and even sea moats or rivers. Okazaki and Himeji is another example where they took the river that was passing by a hill and incorporated that into the design of the castle. In part because it's free labor. You don't have to build it, and the water for the rest of the moats comes from there. But it just makes it so much more complicated. And, for anyone who's listening, who has the slightest interest, there's a couple of websites that I recommend. First of all, Wikipedia. Hello. Who doesn't use Wikipedia on anything? But on Japanese castles, it's particularly good in many languages.
Okay, nice.
So that would be my number one source. A number 2 is called J Castle. Okay. I don't know who made this, but it's a website in English that has bilingual terminology. So it's done by, I think, a long-term resident, and I don't know who. I feel bad now. It didn't occur to me to look this up at the moment. But jcastle.com.
Jcastle, is it maybe jcastle.info?
Yeah, that might be it. That might
info, be yeah. Guide to Japanese castles.
And it's fantastic. It'll go into as much detail as you want. Another place is what is it? Is it? Oh, I just had it a second ago. I looked. Japanguide.com for tourists. They often use japan-guide.com. They have a great castle section.
Oh, okay, cool.
So those, in terms of English anyway, those are the 3 sources that I'd recommend, because you'd see so much more. There are a lot of good books out there in Japanese and in multiple languages, but what I love about Japanese castles is they have it's interesting because I just went to a bar 2 days ago. It's the end of the semester for college teachers, and I was at one of the end of semester drinking parties. Yeah. In a British pub in Kobe, and there was a foreigner a long timer like you and I, who'd been here many years, has family here, so very well integrated. But he said to me the most shocking thing. He goes, I don't really find Japanese castles all that impressive. I was blown back by this. I don't know, is it the fact that the Japanese bathed and the Europeans didn't at the time of castle building? I'm not sure what his edge was, but he really didn't like castles in Japan. And I don't know why, because the plaster,
they're amazing.
By the way, people often ask why it's the white plaster or the black wood lacquer, because those were semi-fireproof. And so, a place that has a lot of thunderstorms and earthquakes, you need to have something that's a little bit flexible and gives with the shaking, but won't burn easily. And white plaster, as they made it in Japan, was semi-fireproof. You can burn it, and when lightning hits it, if it doesn't hit it in the right areas, will burn. And they also use black lacquer. They take wood and burn it so you get that black outer look, and then they'd put a thin shellac of lacquer on that, and that would minimize the flammability of
The catch on fireabilityness of it.
well, it still works. Anyway, so what I love about the castles is they have this organic nature. They are both ornate and elegant, but at the same point in time, for me anyway, they're made. I like that earthiness. They are, European castles are largely made of stone. I mean, not that they didn't have other buildings in the castle, like Japanese castles. We've lost those, administrative and functional buildings. We just have strategic designs. But what I like about Japanese castles is there's just a certain je ne sais quoi. That's a Japanese term, is it not?
Je ne sais quoi, very Japanese, yes.
Yes, but it fits. And I love that, and, when I coming to Himeji and that being my first city in Japan, and we used to hang out in the castle park, and everybody did. Japanese salarymen, young high schoolers, foreign teachers. You had your cigarettes there. You had your hanami parties. You had, that to this day, any city in Japan that has a castle, and quite a few of them do, the castle park is where everybody is hanging out. From Pokemon Go players all the way up.
Just like Osaka Castle Park, right?
Yes,
like that's just a place where people in the city go to relax. Well, PJ, it's been about an hour since we've been conversing. It's been a fantastic talk. I'm sure we could talk for many more hours about this. But
I can.
Yeah, we usually for the Just Japan podcast, but an hour is the time I'm aiming for. So I appreciate that information. And folks, you heard that. Definitely guide.com, jcastle.info, a few other places. I'll share some links in the show notes and on the Facebook page and all of that stuff. But PJ, thanks for coming back on the podcast to tell us all about why you love castles so much.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I know. I definitely love them too. And I got to go to Hiroshima Castle last summer.
Oh, that's a lovely castle.
That was a really nice one. That was very cool. Very cool castle. We enjoyed that one. And again, a nice park as well. Thank you so much, PJ. And I will put links to your Instagram as well. What is that Instagram again for listeners?
Oh, shoot. Now I don't remember. Wow. Is it Kansai _P _J?
Yeah, so
he'll put the links in the show notes.
Kansai _PEE _JAY. Yeah, and I'll put that in the show notes. So go check out.
I do have quite a few pictures of castles, temples, shrines. I do love traditional architecture here. Nice. There's a bit.
So you can even see some pictures of your recent trip to Nagoya and the castles around there. I'm looking at your Instagram right now, and I can see photos up there of your recent travels to see some castles. So Go check that out, folks. Go follow PJ on the Instagram, on the Insta, and all that stuff on the Insta. All right. Well, thanks so much, PJ.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for doing this again. I'm glad that you brought this podcast back, and it's finding new legs.
Yes, as am I.
Well, that does it for another episode of the Just Japan podcast. A big thank you to PJ for coming on the podcast. Remember, as we mentioned, you can find him on Instagram at Kansai _P _J. That's KANSAI _PEE _JAY. And the link will be in the show notes below. Go follow him. You can check out some of the photos of the castles. He also shares a lot of fantastic photos of shrines and temples and great Japanese food and different festivals he goes to. It's an Instagram feed that's definitely worth following. And that's it, guys. Another episode. Hope you all enjoyed that. I certainly enjoyed my conversation with PJ. And let's see a few other things I want to mention, guys. I have another podcast out there that's all about education. Very different than this one. But if you're into that, I would appreciate you coming over and giving a follow to the Nature Talks podcast. That's on all the major podcast platforms. That's my environmental education podcast. Aside from that, guys, I'm just sweating it out in the summer here in Malaysia. But you know what?
I'm in the tropics, but it's nowhere near as hot as Japan. Japan is like 10 times hotter right now in Osaka and Kyoto and Tokyo than it is here. What else is going on? I've started studying Japanese again, which is fantastic. I started using Duolingo. It seems almost everyone in my house is using it right now. I'm using it to study Japanese. My son is using it to study French, and my daughter is now using Duolingo to study Spanish. Still using all the free accounts, of course, but it's interesting. It's a great little tool to brush up on the language and learn more. So that's what's going on with me. Of course, guys, you can follow me on my social media. Go over to Twitter at MadForMaple. You can follow me on Instagram at JlandKev and at Japan Night Scenes. Those are a couple of great places to go to follow me. And of course, go on over and join the Just Japan Podcast Facebook page over on at facebook.com/justjapanstuff. I post stuff there daily, lots of photos from the Wayback Machine in Japan, videos about now, things about now, news links. I make little video blogs specifically only for the Facebook page. So go give me a follow over there. The link is below in the show notes. Facebook.com/JustJapanStuff, and help the podcast grow, folks. I would appreciate it if you could share the Just Japan podcast on your social media. We're on Spotify, we're on Amazon, we're on Apple Podcasts, we're everywhere. Please share this podcast on your social media if you enjoy it. Help us grow. That would be fantastic. And that's it, guys. My name's Kevin O'Shea. I am a Canadian, a podcaster, educator, living currently in Penang, Malaysia. And There'll be some news in the next few months of where we'll be next. So this will be our second but final year in Malaysia. We've been enjoying it, but it will be time to move on after 2 years. And that's the life of the international school teacher that I am. A life of adventure and globetrotting. So that's it, guys. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for enjoying. Wherever you are in the world, I hope you're happy. I hope you're healthy, and I will be talking to you again very soon.